So usually when YouTubers talk about Nerd Ephemer and stuff like that, they usually have like those Funko Pop things or those posters, whatever, just flying all over the place and there's memorabilia and stuff. But as you can tell, my wall is as barren as a DC pit room. Ha! Take that! Successful big brand marketing corporation studio. I got you. But yeah, I don't really have that much unless you want me to see the stacks of comic books I have staring right at me there. Or I have a dressing gown. That's also Marvel, but I don't really want to hang that in this way. I do have, however, there, see, there's a Hulk poster. That's a Hulk poster behind me. Marvel, because I have comic memorabilia subconsciously make you think that I know anything about comic books. So there you go. Actually, I could have just gone to like a marker or something and like drawn glasses on him, like, hey, it's a professor. But you know, I clearly thought that far ahead. So just pretend he has glasses. Anyway, let's talk about Avengers Endgame. Over a month after it came out. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to split this into two categories. Spoiler free, spoiler filled. Spoiler free, I liked it. I thought it was a really good way of summing up everything that's come in the last 11 years. I'll probably give it about a 7 out of 10. It's got some decent action, it's got some really fun pathos. I really kind of connected with where the characters were and their journeys and stuff. And I felt that the Iron Man and Captain America 20-minute long sex scene was both very daring and tastefully done. Oh shit, that was for the spoiler filled part, wasn't it? Okay, so obviously that most people have seen this movie by this point. I mean, it's not like the second highest grossing film of all time, or you know, not adjusting for inflation. I still hasn't been Avatar yet, but like it might or might not. I think it's ending its run, so probably won't. My point being is that most people have seen the film, and I don't really have to like be beware of spoilers, rad. This I'm going to just talk about the film. I want to talk more. I was going to go down like a scene for scene kind of talk about, hey, remember this cool thing? That was cool. But I don't know, I feel like most people have already kind of done that shit. I mean, again, I took way too long to make this, so maybe something a bit more analytical is kind of the better approach than just going like, stuff good, stuff bad. Let's just talk about the movie like generally and what an impact it made and about certain ideas. So this is kind of a reaction to I did a post about Infinity War, which I'll link below, and I talked about a lot about it, how it was like an event comic. As most people probably guess, an event comic is like a huge crossover event where they get all the comics brought in together, and it's big and it's bloated, and every character has some kind of thing in there, and there's pointless deaths, and there's big blow off extravaganzas and stupid shit happens here and there, and most people just end up hating them. And I felt kind of similar to Infinity War. You know, I think Infinity War is better than a lot of event comic books in the Marvel comics and probably DC as well. And I mean, looking at the review again, I wasn't exactly too proud of it. There's this weird air of, you know, comic book films are not exactly the same as they were from when Iron Man first came out, and they don't have the same impact for me. And I mean, so your problems must be what most people at 28 years of age are feeling. Oh no, I'm stuck in a dead end job. I don't know where my life direction is. Oh no, I'm starting a family. I'm not even sure if I'll have the right support network or social net to be able to provide for my children. My comic book movie isn't as fun as it was when I watched these movies when I was younger. Also, I have some serious shade at certain points, some serious shade. But I think the whole thing about the event comics angle for it is that a lot of these stories took a lot of the nuance and the character out of these people, these people, they're not real, out of these characters, out of these comic book superheroes that have expansive, large, ridiculously complex lores in their own books. So like when you transfer them all in together, there has to be watered down in order to be able to tell like a remotely coherent story. And that tends to leave a lot of ideas and thoughts out. And I felt like Infinity War has a lot of that, especially when it came to how they brought in the Guardians and Thor Ragnarok and those other films. But honestly, looking back at it, I think the film has its own solid grounding and it has a really great antagonist. I have the issues, I still do, but I felt that It doesn't fall down the same rabbit holes, but I think this is something that could eventually happen. And I think that it is different from the other Avengers film. The other Avengers films had their core team, well, the other two had their core team, and they just stuck with them, and they had a right enough balance that it didn't feel like it was bogged down by having to incorporate the rest of their stories into it. Whereas this one, this like 2.5 hour and later three, so but 5.5 hours, which is a lot of time, honestly. But they also have to tell their own story. They bring in Thanos, they bring in his myth because he isn't really explained that much beforehand. And this one has to deal with the fallout of a huge cliffhanger that everyone was talking about. There's a lot of weight on their shoulders to pull off the best film they could possibly do. And again, it's the nuance. Nuance is the sacrifice of scale. And I'm not saying that Endgame has no nuance, far from it, but it's bound to not be able to fill all these threads in a satisfying manner. So really the question is, what is this film here to accomplish? And does it accomplish its goals well enough to satisfy what it needs to be? And again, if you compare it to other event movies, you see things like Independence Day or the Transformers films or kind of big scale blockbusters. And the different teams that went through, like 90s were big explosions, destroy everything, rah rah rah. 2000s it was more spectacle, like how cool are these effects, like even Avatar has that. And this one we're transferring more to character. And I think that is definitely the better direction to go in. Absolutely. I appreciate the fact that these movies made people care about these characters, and everything else is just gravy. It's the effects, which sometimes can be like, I think most people have noticed Marvel effects can be kind of ropey in places. Like, I think of Final Black Panthers, those one example comes to my head. There's like huge fight scenes and action sequences and guys beating the shit out of each other. Man, they beat the shit out of each other. So, you know, beaty uppy in these movies. But what's interesting is that everyone loves this film. And until the third act, there was no action, like hardly any. There's that fight scene between the two caps, which is awesome, but there's not a lot in terms of like high octane action scenes. Because compared to all of that stuff, what people really care about is these characters, and that's what keeps them coming back. That's what keeps them invested, and that's what the model of this is actually working. And I think that's great. I think that these movies should focus more on the kind of personal elements that create stories rather than big boom spectacle to get audiences into seats and them having to not remember it at all the second they leave. And that's how you create investment in your audience. How did this work out in that regard? I guess I'll go into more detail, and I'll talk about the structure first of all. How this movie was planned, delineated, and structured to get across its story. So Avengers Endgame is very clearly separated into 3 acts. The first act deals with the follower, the last film, and the consequences of having to lose this. And I love that they kill off Thanos. I'll go more into that later on in terms of what comes after, what comes in at the final act. But in terms of killing him off at the beginning of the story, it's great because it makes sure that they have absolutely nothing. They can't even get revenge. He's dead. It cannot be reversed. It's done. And they have to deal with the idea that they lost spectacularly. Every Avenger has to deal with how they failed in their own way. And I think it has a good weight to it. There's a bit more of a relief compared to how aggressive Infinity War is. I don't think the humor works as well, do that well, but it feels a lot less draggy while also very melancholy, so it manages to pull that balance, which is great. The second act then deals with time travel stuff, which is again a Marvel throwing itself its own ticket parade, or going, oh, look at all these films you loved, and also Thor the Dark World, because why not. And then the third act is the final fight after the snap happens. There's a lot of stuff this movie has to kind of glide through, and even at 3 hours. And in fairness to them, this movie does not feel daddy paced. It flows by. I've watched it 3 times now. I never feel like the movie is bogged down at any point. Maybe certain things, but it feels very flabby. And I think that lack of nuance is the problem, because any of these 3 acts individually could make their own movie. Probably shorter movie as well. But they could be completely fleshed out, and I think that's what's lacking. That's what the other films have advantage, because like when you watch something like Black Panther, I love how they delve into Wakandan culture, or Thor Ragnarok, where they go on this ridiculous fun adventure, and you really get this idea of how crazy and weird this world is, and how it affects Thor as a character, and you really get an insight into his psyche. But now Thor is sharing the screen time with like 7 or 8 other characters that they need to build on and deal with their own stories. And when you think of it that way, the movie almost feels flabby in places because there's a lot of stuff here, but no way of ironing it out, no way of stretching it to make it feel like a more cohesive story within of itself. And I think that could be a bad lesson that other studios could take from it, and other companies, if anyone ever tries to attempt. I don't even think Marvel can attempt what they did with these films 11 years with a payoff that people love. That's unprecedented. And people are going to try to imitate what made this movie work, and hopefully it's not just throw everything into the frying pan and see what sticks. I hope that metaphor made sense. That's how you say that? And that's funny, isn't it? Because in order to fix these problems I seem to have with it, you would either have to make more movies, which, you know, about 4 or 5 different movies based on this one event. It feels a bit much. Or you cut down on certain stuff and expand on other stuff. And I don't really know what you can cut. If you cut something, it will feel off. And yet, this is stopping it from being something more complete and whole and something more satisfying as a conclusion to 11 years in the MCU. Perfectly balanced as flawed things are. I will not apologize for that. And again, a lot of this works excellently so. You really feel the consequences of Infinity War, especially with the 5-year skip. You really feel the set in and what exactly was lost here. I love all the small moments that people get, like Nebula and Rocket holding hands after she comes back to Earth and realizing they're the last left of the Guardians. That's great. That's so impactful. It's such a tiny moment you won't even notice. Scott finding his daughter, though it did bother me the first time I saw it because that girl looks way too old to be his daughter from the first film 5 years on. But it's so emotional and it's really sweet, and it actually made me care about a character I did not give a shit about, which is impressive. I found him kind of fun in Civil War, but I don't like him in his own movies. And the fact that I actually really it really hit me when I saw it again and those two reuniting. That's great character work. I love the monuments as well. And there's small little details like that that really make this movie feel very real in these characters. And I think the Russos are great at that. And it comes from their background in ensemble comedies like Arrested Development and Community. They know how to bring characters together and bring out certain quirks that make them interact off each other. And they're good at character pairings. They're good at making these little ticks memorable and to stick with you. At the same time, I've never found their overall arcs for characters to be the most coherent thing. Like, they even said themselves, Cap doesn't really change in Winter Soldier, even with everything he goes through. I don't think that's a certain flaw, but like, when you're trying to pay off this much build-up, it would work better if your character arcs felt a bit more substantive and it felt a bit more naturally brought into the structure rather than focusing on your big moments and making them all fit into place. They have to have Cap pick up Mjolnir. Captain Marvel destroyed ship. They have Professor Hulk. Actually, Professor Hulk isn't a great example because they don't actually build that up. Because certain minor characters get a lot of really good development. Like Nebula, for example, her character is really wonderfully defined in this, and she actually gets a mini arc that pays off really well. I think she has the most coherent arc. I guess we'll go into how everyone else does, because we look at something like Clint and he has a good setup. Like, he's the first character you see in the movie and he has the most devastating thing. His entire family wiped from him in a blink of an eye right in front of him. It is such an emotional moment, and the Russos do a lot of things with handheld, and I don't think a lot of times that works, but here it's great because it really gets both the natural bond between him and his family and then the immediate chaos of what happened after Thanos' snap. And he goes into his Ronin persona, and we see that for like one scene. That's practically a pretty badass action scene. And then it just kind of comes back, and he has that scene with him and Nat on Vormir, and he's sad that she sacrifices life over him, and then he gets a call from his wife, and there's no real understanding that he has been repenting for his failure. Basically, he has not seemed to resolve his own failure. And then we go on to Nat, which is definitely one of the more controversial ones, especially for people who really don't like this movie. And I can't necessarily say I disagree with them. She is the one person who cannot move on from the failing, or doesn't try to. She's trying to keep everything together and keep everything afloat in place in tandem. Where Cap goes to his little support groups and Tony goes to have a family. She is the one who decides to build herself up and build up a team, and she's definitely the one who's grown a lot because she won't let her failure define her compared to other people. She wants to be able to save people, and it's really noble, and it's a great way for her character to go. If you compare her to being kind of Shield's stooge in Iron Man 2 to who she is now, it feels great. Unfortunately, we get to the bit where she sacrifices herself because she is not as worth of life as Clint is, and there's that really silly moment where they both try to tackle each other and hit each other to stop them from both jumping. Like, the scene individually is just really tonally all over the place, and it doesn't really work. But her character is kind of forgotten about then for a good while. They have a little bit of the thing where Hulk throws a chair, and that's all she gets, which is very insulting because outside of Tony, she's the only one of the original team who dies. Unless you count Cap aging, which nobody does. And it feels like her death did not have nearly as much impact as it should have had. As noble as it is and how it works towards who she was, it does feel like she was left out. And again, if you compare it to the other person who dies, who's Tony gets a huge funeral, and it's the climax of the movie. And I'm not complaining. That obviously makes, he is the granddaddy of the MCU. His death has such an impact, but Nat's does too. And I feel like it was lacking, and that's unfortunate because I really like the character. I already talked about Professor Hulk and how out there, how unfulfilling, just having him become Professor Hulk off screen and presenting it to the audience as a gag really kind of robs them of how he dealt with his failure, which was combine both his personalities together. That's a really interesting facet. I really wish we'd seen it on screen. And yeah, it's unfortunate, but it is what it is. He does get the moment where he puts the glove on and snaps people back to life. I can't stamp my left hand for some reason. This is my left hand, Daniel. He is the one who snaps everyone back to life, definitely. But I wish he had his growth had something more to put in balance with what the story is. I find him very fun in this. I think Mark Ruffalo is having a ball in the role, but he's mostly relegated to Captain Exposition, and it doesn't really feel like, especially compared to what he goes through in Ragnarok and even Infinity War, it doesn't feel like a satisfying resolution to his own little arc that's been going throughout these past few movies, even going back to as far as Age of Ultron, really. Thor is fun, and I actually do like Fat Thor. I know there's been a lot of controversy surrounding what happens to him and how they depict his weight, and sometimes they play it for a joke, but the only times I can think of is the first time you see him, the sight gag is to see how much he has changed, and Rocket compares him to ice cream. Outside of that, it's mostly people making fun of how weird he, like the Lebowski thing, how weird he dresses, how out there he seems. If you still have an issue with the weight thing, and the thing about his mom having a salad, but like, I see it compared to my own mother, and it's just like, yeah, it's just something moms do, really. If you have a problem with it, I get it. I'm not trying to take that away from you, and I can't really say my own thing because I'm a pretty heavy fucker myself. I can't really say that it bothered me as much as it did other people, but I'm not every person. As for how his arc is handled, I really like that scene where that bit where he grabs Hulk by the collar and he says, "Don't say that name about Thanos." That's so good. It's so emotional, and Chris Hemsworth really sells it. But again, mostly they play him for comedy, and the moments where we do get a bit of an arc, it's just his one conversation with his mother, which I love that scene, and I'm finally glad they found some use of Rene Russo in these movies. Like, fuck, you dropped a ball in Thor and Thor 2. You gave her one fight scene in Thor the Dark World, and that was nice and everything, but he actually has some impact on and weight onto the story. He has one little conversation with his mom and grabs Mjolnir, and that moment's great, and Chris Hemsworth really plays the elation so much. Like, he is so good in this role. I have a feeling he's going to continue on after this. I mean, that's what they hint at, and I really want him to just play this role for the rest. He's so good in it. But yeah, when he grabs the hammer and he says, "I'm worthy," you feel the weight being brought off him, pun unintended, sorry. You feel the elation and the burden that he's been feeling for so long, and the depression just make him feel like his depression and his failure does not define him as a person. And that was really uplifting. That was really happy to see, and it makes you feel very warm inside. But then he doesn't really have much else going on for the rest of the film. He fights Thanos again, but it has zero impact, which is weird considering how the last film ended. His little arc about his downbeat spirit, it should have been fleshed out a little bit more. Maybe bring it on to the third act, however they can do that. And that leaves us with Steve and Tony. Steve's is more of a culmination of what he's been going through since Winter Soldier. He is a man of the time. He cannot embrace the world that he was dropped into. And that's something he cannot live with. And I think this movie has a perfect culmination of that, where he actually goes back in time and is with Peggy and he gets his dance. And I love it. And it made me cry so much. And I legitimately cried when I saw him dance with Peggy. It was sweet. It was perfect. It was so emotionally satisfying. And one of the best scenes is where he's trying to convince other people to move on with their lives. And he can't believe his own bullshit. Because he hasn't moved on since he came out of the ice. And he gets that reward, and it's great, and I think he deserves it. And it feels a little bit better set up because it seems paid off in the long run, which I really like. And we see that when he travels back with Tony into the 70s and he sees Peggy for the first time. And it's great because I feel their arcs are very intertwined, very interconnected. This is definitely pulled out by the fact that we see Tony give Steve his shield, and the reminder that it was Howard who gave Steve that shield in the first place, and they are very much combined as characters. Steve learns through Tony that there is more to life than sticking to your principles, and that's what he does at the end. He finds himself alive. Tony learns that giving up everything and risking everything for the greater good is not always going to be secure, and sometimes that doesn't have to be, because Tony, throughout most of his character arc since the Avengers, has been about letting go of the idea that he can control everything that goes on in his life. He can't. And the best way he learns that is becoming a parent, because you are never going to be able to convince your child that everything is going to be okay, because that's not the world we live in. And Tony has to have a physical life there to prove to him that not everything is under his control. And this is after the effects of Infinity War and how much that has weighed on his mind. He was put in a moment where he could not put a suit of armor over everything and protect it. And he has this little person that he has to build, he has to nurture and protect, and he doesn't know if he can. And the important thing that he learns is that he can be there as best as possible and ensure a better future for his daughter, but he can't stop the inevitability of his own mortality. And he kind of learns this through seeing Howard as well. And that's a really beautiful moment, that he finally gets to find a peace with his father, who he's had such a difficult time with over his entire life, and where Howard says he'd give everything for him, but also that he hopes that he doesn't become like him. It's really great because it makes Tony realize that his father really did care about him, and even though he displayed it in probably not the best way, life did turn out okay, and that gives Tony the strength to move past his worries completely, and it leads into what he does at the end, killing himself to save the world. Save the universe. It's about him realizing he's not leaving everything behind in unsafe hands. He has everyone else, the other Avengers. Him and Steve have probably the best kind of arcs throughout it. And the others feel a bit more unsure, unfortunately, because we have stuff like Falcon becoming Cap and Valkyrie becoming the leader of Asgard. And they don't feel too in line with their character arcs, and I felt like those moments could have been better built up to. But you can't really do that in this film because they're gone from, well, the Valkyries, and they just don't bother with her for most of it. But Falcon is gone for most of the film. So, I don't know, what can you do? Maybe they'll flesh them out more in future films. I hope so, anyway. I don't feel like what happens to Valkyrie in this film matches up to what happens to her in Ragnarok, but I'm willing to sit there and see how they build this up in future films, because I really hope she comes back, because I really like the character. When I talk about the structure, we'll talk about the characters not having fully complete arcs. I think it's something like the final battle, and it's a huge battle and it's great, but a lot of it doesn't really fit to service of the actual story that's being told. It feels rather insubstantial. It feels gratuitous. But at the same time, why would I get rid of the final battle? Why would I get rid of the Avengers coming out of the portals, Cap saying Avengers Assemble, him grabbing Mjolnir, that first time he sees it, them tossing Mjolnir and Stormbreaker together? Those are great moments. And maybe you could do something like mix up the idea of having all the villains come back through some time shenanigans and having them come and then meet the final battle. Because the one thing that really doesn't work about this film is Thanos. Later on, when the 2014 version comes across, he's way less interesting. He's way more megalomaniacal. And I like the idea that they're basically saying that Thanos in Infinity War is just a jerk. He's just a really powerful asshole with a god complex. And we're probably taking his words too seriously because we were following him in Infinity War. There's something you could say about that, but it does rob a lot of intrigue and nuance from him from Infinity War. Because it's a character it's not the same Thanos, it's one from a couple of years prior, before both his daughters betrayed him, before he killed his own daughter. It really kind of cheapens him as a character, because this is the one we're having the big climactic kill off with, rather than the one we killed 10 minutes at the start of the film. And again, I feel that cheapens that death as well, because don't bring him back. I'm not saying this is what they should have done, it's honestly an idea came up in about 10 minutes, but honestly, if literally the only impact the villains have is to give our heroes a challenge, then why not? Why do we not have a final fight at all? I mean, I don't think the film is going to go that far in terms of what it's willing to dare. It nearly does, because again, most of the film is very action-like, but I think that's because they're building up to this scene, and I guess audience would not have been satisfied. I definitely wouldn't have been satisfied. And there's plenty of ideas I could work around if I actually took time to sit down and actually come up with it. But again, I'm not being paid by one of the largest conglomerates on the world to write for their big summer blockbuster films. They're raking billions of dollars. So, like, what the fuck do I know? I'm just saying how I feel, and I feel that the final fight does not work in regards of having an emotionally satisfying payoff for this film in general. Tony's death at the end has a satisfying payoff, but the rest of the fight just feels gratuitous. I hate saying that because I love the final fight, and I don't know, I wouldn't want to get rid of it, but I think it should be done to shake up, maybe have more arcs fulfilled in that moment instead of having character moments. That's one way you could have done it. If this final fight is just to see Tony sent off in a blaze of glory, then it is what it is, and I appreciate it for that. I appreciate it anyway because I like it. I'm not trying to say I dislike it. I'm trying to say it feels like they could have done something a bit differently to make it feel like it's a bigger impact to what happens in the story. That's my thought. This is a great film. I like how they managed to get towards this. 10 years ago, you would not have thought that this kind of film would have even remotely happened in a massive Hollywood scale like this. It's a huge love letter to what Marvel has been doing for the past 11 years. And if nothing else, I appreciate that level of commitment they have to making something that entertaining and that much fun. And something that does have a lot of emotional moments paid off here and there, even if overall I don't think it's that coherent. I think it's stuff that Hollywood can take moving forward when in terms of crafting a blockbuster and make it more character focused, and maybe tie up the more flabby bits to make it feel like a more coherent story, make it more coherent arcs going through. But as it stands, this movie's fun, and I definitely really enjoyed it, and I would watch it again. Absolutely. Brought Infinity War 2. I think Infinity War is a bit of a stronger film, but I was more satisfied with Endgame, if that makes sense. Even with my belly aching about it. I think this was a huge risk that definitely paid off, and Hollywood can learn from it, both from its failures, but most importantly from its successes. I'm not as jaded, as cynical as I was last year towards the whole Marvel experiment. Wherever it goes from here on out, I think it has to take a vastly different direction compared to the whole Infinity Stones saga thing, because I don't think they'll pay off something that huge in the future. But at the end of the day, I'm just glad all of this is assembled. I feel like I'm just advertising for like the Court Film Fest. Hey, green. Oh yeah, was anybody else really bothered by the time travel? Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream. Bum, 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 bum.